In the name of our loving and liberating and life-giving God, amen. All the cool kids are using their iPads now. Actually, they changed the settings for the copier, and I can't get my laptop to talk to the copier, but that's another story. Dr. Maria Neira of the World Health Organization tweeted this last week, "Yes, it's hot, but this could be one of the coolest summers of the rest of your life." Ugh. Yes, it's hot, but this could be one of the coolest summers of the rest of your life. This sermon emerged almost immediately after last Sunday's worship with Living Water. Those of you that were there heard in the prayers of the people an intercession that caught people's imagination, because I heard 3 different people talking about it in the Lutheran prayers of the faithful. God of all creation, you reveal your goodness through all you have made. Rivers, seas, plants, animals, endangered species. Prosper the work of conservation organizations, botanical gardens, zoos, and wildlife sanctuaries. Hear us, O God, for your mercy is great. And so I began to think about creation care. I've not preached much about the creation that surrounds us. We're here on Kent Island are based in the midst of a beautiful piece of creation. And the world around us is quite remarkable. There are many in this place who work in industries that are related to the bay or the protection of the bay or larger worldviews of the way in which creation surrounds us. So I want to talk to you today some about the Episcopal Church's understanding of our responsibility for the care of creation. At General Convention 2 times ago, the General Convention approved a statement that the Jesus movement, that is to say Christianity, those of us who walk in the way of Jesus, is an ongoing community of people whose lives are centered on Jesus of Nazareth, who follow him into a loving, liberating, life-giving relationship to God. And as a whole church, we have promised to place the care of God's creation at the heart of our common life. Together, we have taken up church-wide action to safeguard the integrity of creation and to sustain and renew life on earth. Now, because this comes in the Michael Curry administration, it's going to have loving and liberating and life-giving pieces to it. The loving piece of this is that we are a network of Episcopalians dedicated to the care and protection of the whole creation, cultivating circles for the sharing of stories. You see, the sharing of stories about creation is important. We need to share our perceptions of how God moves in the world about us and the food at our table and what happens to the things that when we are done with them. One of my heroes in this regard is a man named Wendell Berry, a Kentucky man, a scholar of great renown and an author of both novels and poems. Wendell Berry, for me, is one of the most rooted human beings, and if I gave you no other gift today, it would be to go home and find some of Wendell Berry's writings. He says, whether we and our politicians know it or not, nature is party to all our deals and all our decisions. She has more votes, she has a longer memory, and she has a sterner sense of justice than we do. Nature has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice. Berry goes on to say, we have lived our lives under the assumption that what's good for us would be good for the world. And we have been wrong. We must change our lives to live in the contrary assumption that what is good for the world will be good for us. And that requires that we make efforts to know the world and what is good for it. It is so important that we tell stories about how we heal the world, how we can work with the creation that God gave us dominion of in the first chapter of Genesis. But the trouble is that there are many Christians that seem confused by this. One of the places that I went to look to was the Pew Research Center. It's important because Pew does open-minded and wonderful questioning of people. And it turns out that Pew had done a survey in November of 2022 of religion and the environment, in which they determined that 9 in 10 atheists say the earth is getting warmer, mostly due to human activity, and that evangelical Protestants only have 32% that believe that the earth is getting warmer because of human activity. If this sermon is about anything, it is to renounce a silly idea that somehow we aren't part of the things that are happening around us that make our environment more dangerous, more hazardous, more life-taking. Now, it's probably because evangelical Protestants cited two reasons. That there are much bigger problems in the world today than climate change, and that God is in control of climate. Now, I can't debate either of those. There certainly are wars and pestilence and difficulties around, but climate change affects every human being, all 8 billion of us on the earth. And indeed, if God is in charge of climate, God has put us here with the purpose of being part of the way in which climate is both changed for the worse and for the better. God is not a puppet that simply goes around manipulating clouds to make it rain in one place and not in another. Another possible reason why evangelical Protestants stand in this view is that they believe that we should value the same things that were important to the generations that came before us. 2/3 of all evangelicals say, whatever was good enough for Grandpa is good enough for me. And the trouble is that Grandpa didn't have the kind of industrial impact on the world that we have today. So Americans with a lower level of religious commitment are much more likely than those with medium or high levels of religious commitment to believe that the earth is getting warmer because of human activity. I am here to assure you that both your activity in this church and our desired impact on the world is more important than any view that we have that we can somehow stand aside. In fact, the House of Bishops in the last General Convention said that if we hope to treat all human beings with dignity, we must address climate change so droughts and floods and extreme weather patterns don't force people into exile and to desperate, life-threatening migration. If we hope to build peace, we must address climate change so that the competition for scarce resources do not drive future violence. And if we hope to ensure that every child of God has enough to eat, we must address climate change so that our bountiful earth can continue to support and sustain food systems that nourish people and their souls. That's the narrative that we need to share, to speak out loud about our part in the dominion of the world, our part in the care of creation, and our part for others. Loving is followed by liberating. In the liberating portion of our statement of the Episcopal Church, we must stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable victims of the impact of climate change, particularly women, poor people, and people of color, as part of seeking the liberation. Mercy Corps is a wonderful institution that works worldwide, and they published a study on how climate change affects people living in poverty. And they cited two things that were predominantly laid upon the poor and those who are disenfranchised in their nations. Undernutrition is the largest one. 690 million people, almost 9% of our whole global population, is undernourished. Now, this is most prevalent in Africa, but the largest increase in undernutrition is in Latin America and the Caribbean. Nearly 50,000 people a day fall into this poverty of undernutrition in Latin America and the Caribbean every day. 50,000 people who do not have enough on their plate to sustain themselves. And that's why migration begins to happen. And the second piece of this, after undernutrition, is refugees. Nearly 70% of all the displacements in the first 6 months of 2020 were the result of weather-related disasters. 9.8 million people lost their homes, their livelihoods, and family members to natural disasters. And so what do? We can be loving and we can think about liberating, but what is the life-giving piece of this? The first is to have a clear-eyed view of the world that we find ourselves in. I've already said we've now reached the number 8 billion people on the planet. That's a 2.5-fold increase since the day I was born. There were less than 3 billion people on the planet. I'm not responsible for all the ones that came along in that time period, but we've gone from less than 3 billion to 8 billion people in 60 years. And the most populous countries in the world, Last week, the United Nations offered its annual assessment of population around the world, and they said by the year 2050, just 25 years from now, the largest country in the world will be India, with 1.67 billion people. China's population is beginning to slip a bit because of the one-child policy that they had for many years. China's the second largest, and the third largest may become as a surprise to you because it's been the United States for so many years. But by 2050, the third largest country on the planet will be Nigeria. A nation the size of Texas will have more people living in it than the United States of America. And you can imagine that being under-resourced in a place like Nigeria would have amazing, awful, terrible effects on people. The top 10 is rounded out by Pakistan, Indonesia, Brazil, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. All of these places live, for the most part, right at the edge. Back during the George Bush administration, the president started an initiative called the Global Change Research Project. George Bush, father of George W. Bush, wanted to make sure that we were beginning to think in 1989 about the ways that we could address global change. And it's come out every 5 years. The Global Change Initiative was then approved by the Congress, and every 5 years they make a report. What they said was that the effects of climate change are steadily worsening and now threatening nearly every aspect of life in the United States. The United States, on the whole, has warmed about 2.5 degrees since 1970 in just 50 years, and about 1.6 degrees of warming worldwide. So we are warming faster in the United States. Now, part of that is because the ocean temperatures, which are also rising, are not rising as fast as the land temperatures. But no matter what, we must find ways to address the far-reaching and worsening conditions. Today in the gospel, we hear of how a sower went out to sow. Early agricultural means simply meant that you went out into the field and you threw your seed wherever they would go, and you hoped they would grow, and you hoped at the end you would harvest them. It's kind of a crazy agricultural system, but it worked for those people. And those seeds that actually hit the good soil produced 100-fold or 60-fold or 30-fold. There was a possibility of great reward from the work that the sower did in fidelity. Perhaps you've heard the story of the young girl walking along the beach where thousands of starfish have been washed up during a terrible storm. When she comes to eat starfish, she would pick it up and throw it back in the ocean. People were watching and laughing. She'd been doing this for some time when a man approached her and said, "Little girl, why are you doing this? Look at this beach. You can't save all these starfish. You can't begin to make a difference." The girl, seemingly crushed, suddenly deflated, but after a few moments, she bent down, picked up another starfish, hurled it as far as she could into the ocean, and said to the man, "I made a difference for that one." My hope is that today you might be feeling empowered to reach down to the starfish on the beach. It may be in your recycling. It may be in the places you choose to drive or not to drive to. It may be in simple acts, or it may be rattling the forces of our legislatures, both in the state and in Congress, to say to them, we need to address climate change. I conclude with another quote from Wendell Berry, and I hope that you'll make Wendell one of your prophets for the last 100 years. So, friends, every day, do something that won't compute. Give your approval to all that you cannot understand. Ask questions that have no answers. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under trees every 1,000 years. Laugh. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. Practice resurrection. Friends, I believe with all my heart and soul that God loved this world and made it in love. And I believe that God made us in love. And as we collaborate and look at our creation, look at this piece of property, look at your homes and the things that you do in your life, that we might well become agents that make a small change, a simple change, and a change that will allow the rest of the world to see that we stand in solidarity with our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. And together we stand to profess our faith. The words of the Nicene Creed are